start as we're at the allotted time. So welcome to everybody this morning. We're a week away from the general election. So this is our hustings for staff. The idea is to encourage political discourse among our staff and ensure that they're well informed and able to engage fully in the general election and the various arguments that the candidates put forward. Of course, you're all free to talk about the event and the statements you hear this afternoon on social media, but in doing so, if you could ensure you represent yourself as the polite professionals that I know that you are. Do also feel free to tweet as long as your phone or device is in silent or vibrate mode. We're using both Twitter at hashtag GE2017 and via Yammer for Cambridge Assessment, colleagues using the same hashtag. On an admin point, we are expecting, I hope, a few fireworks, but not a fire as such. So if there is a fire alarm, it will be real. Fire bell sounds as a continuous bell or siren, and on hearing this, please leave via the nearest fire exit and then assemble in the sunken garden outside. So, as to the format, what we'll do is we'll have each candidate speak for 5 minutes to you from the lectern. They're aware that the candidates are mainly from the Cambridge City constituency, which they're fighting, but there will obviously be residents from either Cambridge City or its surrounding constituencies as well. And then after that, there'll be an opportunity for questions. And the way we'll deal with that is you'll be able to question each individual candidate, and then other candidates will have an opportunity to respond. I will try and mediate some of that if need be, as it'd be desirable to avoid a repetition of yesterday's rather chaotic scenes in the Senate House, but I'm sure that we won't be reduced to that anyway. So what I'd like to do is kick off. You have biographies of the candidates which have already been handed out, so I'm not going to repeat those. And we'll start off and run things in alphabetical order of the parties. So that means, John, if we can, we'll start with you on behalf of the Conservatives. Your 5 minutes are commencing now, and Carrie will wave at me when time is up, and I also will start making noises and things of that sort to distract you and make you aware that the time is over. So over to you.
Great. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. I guess for the voters of Cambridge, there are two fundamental questions that you'll be asking yourselves in a week's time. A national question and a local question. Nationally, do we want to continue with the leadership that means we are still one of the strongest growing economies in the Western world? Or do we want to risk all that for the chaos of a possible hung parliament led by a man who doesn't even have the confidence of the majority of his own MPs? Locally, I am offering something very different from all the other candidates to my left, or your right as you're looking. I'm not a typical career politician. So I trained in Cambridge 6 years as a scientist. I went overseas in the international charity sector. I've had a career in adult education. And then in more recent years, I've got involved in social reform and policy making, working with government ministers and others in Westminster. I already have influence. I already have the ear of people who will be making decisions with Theresa May after the election. And what I want to be is a strong voice for Cambridge. I want to make the concerns of the 74% of people in Cambridge who voted Remain in last year's referendum, as well as the concerns of the 26% who voted Leave, the concerns of the universities, the concerns of the hospitals, the concerns of the high-tech sector. That we need to have flexible as well as controlled immigration after we have left the EU. We are leaving the EU. The government, as it promised in the booklet that it put out to every household ahead of the referendum, has invoked Article 50 in accordance with the majority decision of the nation. It wasn't the majority decision of us here in Cambridge, but it has been invoked, and within 2 years we will have left the EU. The question is, what terms will we be leaving on? On what basis will we get a deal that is beneficial to Cambridge? We could next week, choose an ex-MP who will promise to fight angrily from the opposition benches. Or we can choose me, a strong voice who already has the ear of government and will be able to make those concerns clear, that we want to be able to continue attracting foreign students. We want to continue to be able to participate in some of the academic programs across the EU. We need to continue to be able to attract the foreign nurses and doctors on which our NHS depends. And we need to be able to continue to attract the high-skilled workforce on which our tech industry depends. We need a strong voice for Cambridge. I will be that strong voice, and I look forward to being the Conservative representative for MP here in Cambridge, because when I first came as a student, this was a Conservative-held city. I know there's been a lot of tactical voting. People vote Lib Dem to keep Labour out, Labour to keep Lib Dem out. This election really is different. As Tony Blair said, this election goes beyond party allegiance, and this is about the future direction of the country. I joked to Mr. Corbyn's camera today at the other end of the table just before. This table seems to be shifted rather leftwards on the stage, and I wonder if that's representative of the way in recent years our political spectrum has gone from being a left-right choice to a centre and far-left choice. My friends in the former Soviet Union cannot believe that we as a nation are even considering voting in Mr. Corbyn with his communist and Marxist-backed manifesto. We need to pursue the centrist route of a compassionate and considerate Conservative.
Thank you, John. Stuart, your turn.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for coming. I'm Stuart Tuckwood. I want to be the Green Party's first Member of Parliament for Cambridge City. I appreciate a lot of you won't know me. I don't have the same profile as Daniel or Gillian. I'm a nurse. I work at Adam Brooks Hospital. I've worked in social care before that, looking after people with learning disabilities, looking after people with mental health issues and vulnerable children as well. I've got a history of public service. I'm a Unison steward at the hospital as well, where I work to represent people, to fight to protect their interests. And that's the kind of job that I would be doing if I was your Member of Parliament as well. But I don't only have the heart to change politics, I have the intelligence and the capability as well. I've helped co-author reports on the effects of Brexit on Cambridge City and also on the effects of health inequalities in this city, so I have a good understanding and a grip on the issues that face Cambridge. We've heard a lot about chaos recently. We heard a lot about it last night, and we've heard a lot about it already today. I'd like to dwell on that word, chaos, and I'd like to think about the chaos that comes from committing to a referendum without any contingency plan about what happens if you lose that referendum. The chaos of promising not to hold an election and then going back on that promise and holding one very soon after. Have a think about the chaos that's been affecting our public services in recent years. As I've said, I work at Adam Brooks Hospital and I've worked in social care. Think about the chaos of trying to place patients in the correct beds and get them the care that they need when there's underfunding, when there's staffing issues that make all those things almost impossible a lot of the time. And let's think about the chaos that will result from failing to address climate change properly. We're seeing what's happening at the moment. Donald Trump wanting to pull back from the Paris Climate Change Accord, and we've got a Conservative Party and other political parties that are failing to address the problem properly. If we don't change course in 4 years, we're possibly going to blow any chance we've got of keeping global warming to a manageable level. And we've got a party that might take power that is intent on fracking the countryside rather than making the decisions we need to invest in a green future. It's often said by people that the Green Party is unrealistic and ideological. I'd put it to you today that we're the only party that's actually taking a realistic view of our problems and the long-term solutions that we need to those problems. So rather than in coming years having a race to the bottom of cutting taxes and cutting public services, let's think about building a highly skilled, highly productive economy. Let's stop subsidising fossil fuels and instead invest in the technologies of the future and the green energy that we need. Rather than dropping out of the EU like a stone, rather than the smart Brexit or the flexible Brexit or the red, white and blue Brexit, all of these Brexits will be a nightmare for our country if we lose free movement of people and we lose access to the single market. So let's embrace the benefits that free movement has brought us, and let's work together with our European neighbours and trust people in this country that they can make the final decision on the options that we're given. And let's, more than anything, be realistic about the threats of climate change. We need to make decisions about combating that threat in the next 5 years. If you want those green decisions to be made, you can't wait another 10 or another 15 years. They need to be made in this next Parliament, and none of the other candidates here are willing to take that challenge seriously. I'm desperate for change. The Green Party is desperate for change. We know more than anyone that we need to beat the Tories. I work at a hospital. I understand that. which is why we've stepped down in a number of constituencies across the country to give other parties the best chance of beating the Conservatives. But here in Cambridge, they're not going to win. You can vote for what you believe in. You can vote for better. So if you want real change and you want real solutions, then back the Green Party on June the 8th.
Thank you very much, Stuart. Now, Daniel, you can speak on behalf of the Labour Party.
Well, thank you very much, Simon. Good afternoon, everybody. In an uncertain, changing world, one of the few certainties is the Cambridge Assessment hustings. This is the third time we've been here, 2010, 2015, 2017. It's one of my favourite events in this beautiful setting. And those of you who are here in 2010 will remember that the late lamented Simon Sedgwick Gell stood in for Tony Juniper that day for the Greens. And I think delivered a barnstorming performance, which I was rather jealous of at the time. Sadly, of course, actually now, he was probably pretty much outlining the current Labour manifesto. And I think he would be looking down and watching this election with some sense of irony. But if some things are unchanging, for Cambridge Assessment, of course, it has been a time of huge change and I think some optimism with the move to the Triangle. I was lucky enough to be taken around the site in February with Simon and others. And at the top of the tower, a view that's almost as good as the top of the university library. I tell you, as an MP, you do get to see some good things in Cambridge. Very impressed by the Sustainable Travel Plan, very impressed by the quality of the design and the build, but also struck that the workforce seemed to be from all around the globe and all across the European Union. Also, so many meeting rooms. We love meetings in Cambridge. It's like heaven. It's going to be heavenly for you, I suspect. And I've also valued working closely with people from Cambridge Assessment over the last years. I'm quite aware that it hasn't been a particularly easy period, particularly for OCR, in a difficult educational landscape with resources challenging. And I know that finding qualified examiners remains a challenge. 3 quick comments I wanted to make in the opening statements. Firstly, on Brexit. I think all of you know my position. Totally opposed, voted against Article 50 at every opportunity. But I do think that example of the workforce working on your new building actually does tell a story which I'm afraid, sadly, we weren't able to tell sufficiently well last year to convince others, because it's actually been having that workforce that can move from country to country quickly, which allows us to build these wonderful buildings in a cost-efficient manner. Now, from Labour's perspective, it's very clear what we're promising. If we win, we will guarantee the rights of EU nationals immediately. And I know that matters to huge numbers of people, not just the people who are working here, but their friends, families, workmates. For me, it's absolutely essential we do that quickly. Stay in Horizon 2020, stay in Erasmus, stay in the European Medicines Agency, stay in Euratom, stay as closely in the single market as it is possible to do. Now, I think that's a very, very different position from the one being outlined by the Conservatives. I want us to stay in the EU, but if we can't, I want us to be as close as we possibly can. Second point, and one that's not been raised in the hustings so far. I'm a Shadow Transport Minister. I was very disappointed to see in the Conservative manifesto no mention of Crossrail 2. And I and others have worked really hard over the last few years, as others did in the previous Parliament. Very important for Cambridge, because the forward-tracking of some of the line down to Liverpool Street is essential to turn that line into something reasonable. It's Victorian, quite frankly, a lot of it. And new trains, yes, but new trains need to run on new track. And the dropping of Crossrail 2, I think, is a huge disappointment to a range of people. And I'm hoping it was an omission, a mistake. And maybe John can perhaps go back to colleagues and check. But thirdly, a point about education and a plea for funding on our schools. It is just desperate as far as I can see. And we've had hustings where people have been talking about this. The Association of Teachers and Lecturers has produced a very good website which shows the impact of the various parties' funding plans on our local schools. And I'd encourage you to go and look at it. But just 2 local examples around here. Just around the corner at St Paul's, the Tories win. Their plans projected forward based on the Institute of Fiscal Studies approach means that they will lose something like £67,000 by 2022, roughly 2 teachers. Sadly, under the Liberal Democrat plans, they would still lose about £38,000 a teacher. Labour's investment would mean an extra teacher and an extra 20,000. Go to Parkside, the figures are 300,000, lose 8 teachers, and the Lib Dems, 184,000, or 6 teachers, 5 teachers rather. With Labour, an extra teacher, an extra £24,000. So I think it's a big, big choice at this election. I haven't even talked about tuition fees or educational maintenance allowance. We may come on to that. It's basically a choice between resources going to the many or being kept by the few. Money for big business or money for your child or your grandchild? You know, sometimes politics just doesn't seem that hard to me.
Thank you. Spot on time. And finally, Julian, if you can conclude on behalf of the Liberal Democrats.
Well, thank you, Simon. It's great to be back here and see so many friends and colleagues around the audience. And I have huge admiration for all that Cambridge Assessment does, and I'm quite excited also by the triangle, as Daniel described. And I promise not to make any references to Shakespearean errors or anything like that. It's also, though, quite nice that all of us have shown up. John didn't send a stand-in for this debate, so you're getting all of us. Your work is something I've been particularly interested in for a very long time. I actually worked for a bit for the OECD, looking at Bulgarian education policy, and how do you try and shape that? How do you assess in a context like that? We may come on to some of those things. I want to reflect on a few of the broader issues. Firstly, in many ways, this has been a really strange election nationally. Brexit, which is the thing which historians will be writing about when they write about what was happening now, has almost not been the main subject of discussion. We've heard very, very little actual information on it. And I can see why that is. It's partly because both the Conservatives and Labour are pushing for Brexit. Both have said, Daniel admitted this earlier, they've said no to the single market, no to free movement. The manifestos are both quite clear. And I think that's hugely problematic. I think we should never have had the referendum, but we are here. But we can still give people a choice. I'm a passionate pro-European, and I would continue to fight for us to be in the single market with free movement much closer than the others. EU citizens have been touched on. They are our friends, our neighbours, our colleagues. Many of you will be EU citizens or will have very close friends who are. We absolutely have to protect them. We fought that fight through the Commons and the Lords. Sadly, Labour abstained in the Lords when it could have been written in at the time. If you oppose Brexit, and I hope that most of you do, you should vote for an anti-Brexit party. That is the choice at this election that will make a difference. The other reason it's quite strange is we are still stuck in this slightly bizarrely post-fact era. We've seen it happen around the world with the terrifying events with Trump. We saw it in the Brexit referendum debate. Anybody remember that 350 million for the NHS that was about to come in and transform the NHS? What people learnt was that it's possible to lie and make numbers up and get away with it. And I think that is a big problem for our politics. The Institute of Fiscal Studies, which is an extremely well-regarded think tank, has had a look at the various manifestos. And they were damning of both the Labour and Conservative manifestos, describing them as dishonest. That's not a word that they would use accidentally. The numbers simply do not add up. What you're being offered is all sorts of things plus a pony, and that's easy to do if you don't actually intend to ever deliver it. It's like the 350 million for the NHS. And I think that is a huge, huge problem. Now, I'm not saying they said our manifesto was costed perfectly. They did describe it as the best costed. And it does involve putting a lot more money in things like the NHS. We've been very clear, 1p on income tax. It's a very progressive way of raising just over £6 billion for the NHS and social care, with a particular focus on mental health, something I've been passionate about for a very, very long time. On education, we provide an extra £7 billion for schools and for colleges. Daniel's figures, by the way, weren't right. I think they're updating the website. It's not Daniel's fault. The source data was wrong, and I think they're in the process of correcting that. And that would mean that we can actually make sure that we remove the cuts. We can protect per pupil funding, extend free school meals to the entirety of primary, and actually provide more support and pay for teachers. So I think there are a lot of things there which are quite important. And as I say, we've been clear how they will be funded, which is really important for any of you who, like me, are interested in evidence, facts, and what you can actually do. I think the other question that you have to decide about is what you see as the role of an MP. There's always a challenge between speaking out on things, saying, I don't like that, things should be more like that, and actually making a difference and getting things done. And as an MP, I managed to get quite a lot of extra things done, nationally and locally, which I'm really quite proud of. That delivery matters. Schools in Cambridgeshire had been underfunded for many, many decades, and I managed to get an extra £23.2 million extra for those schools. I got the money needed to get Papworth Hospital to actually move to the Addenbrooke site, something that's been tried for decades, never happened. Huge amount of work to make sure Cambridge North Station actually opened, and that's made a big difference. A lot of work, which is being continued, trying to make sure Addenbrooke Station actually happens. The East-West rail line, housing on that, so we can actually start to tackle some of the housing problems. More money for transport here. But also that international, that national picture. I was one of the people who co-sponsored the bill that requires us to put 0.7% of our gross national income on international development aid, helping millions and billions of people around the world. That is making a difference. I was part of the team that got same-sex marriage and a lot more. So I hope you'll vote for somebody who will actually deliver for you.
Thank you very much. Right, we're into question time. There will be microphones coming round, and if I could ask those of you who have a question to wait for the microphone once you're called, stand up, state your name, and then ask the question. If you're directing the question to a particular candidate, if you could say that specifically at the time you ask the question. We're also live streaming this, so we will be introducing questions from our online audience, if any of those crop up, or if there are longers because you're not coming up with the questions, but I'm sure that is not likely to be the case. Is there anybody who would like to start us up? Question here, first of all, and then there. If you stand up and the microphone's just coming.
Yes, hello. My name's Crispin Davis and I work for Cambridge English in assessment, and my question is primarily aimed at Julian. I remember that in 2010 people voted Liberal Democrat, and the Liberal Democrat Party found itself in the role of kingmakers. Who do you intend to go with this time? Should you be in a similar fortunate position?
Yes, I mean, in 2010, we didn't actually have that choice. Cameron had become Prime Minister before we reached any sort of agreement. We did try to talk to Labour. Labour made it fairly clear they weren't that interested. And frankly, us plus Labour didn't add up to enough. And I think a minority coalition would not possibly have worked. So the choice was a Tory majority government or a coalition. I think we've seen the huge harms now in the last couple of years from a Tory majority government. So Conservatives alone, to my mind, would have been a lot worse. We've been very clear this time, however, that we wouldn't do a coalition with anyone. There is no way that we could work with such a right-wing, authoritarian, nasty, and frankly, extremely pro-Brexit Conservative Party. As they are now, it just wouldn't be possible. But equally, well, Jeremy Corbyn's ruled out doing coalitions with anybody as well, but I don't think we could do a deal with Corbyn and Labour either. In reality, I think particularly with the problems that he does have with his MPs, who would you actually be negotiating with? What would the policies actually be? So there won't be a coalition. Personally, I'm very much in favour of some of the Progressive Alliance work. I'm a director of the Joseph Rowntree Reform Trust, and we've been funding things like More Unite and some of the Progressive Alliance work. And as Stuart mentioned earlier, there have been some very nice examples where we've stood down to try to help them. I called for us to stand down to help Caroline Lucas in Brighton, who's excellent. Sadly, we haven't seen Labour playing ball. In North West Surrey, I think it was Jeremy Hunt's seat, there was a local GP who'd taken him to court who wanted to stand to defend the NHS. Fantastic idea. We said we'd back her. The Greens pulled out and backed her. Labour activists said they would back her, and they were then expelled from the Labour Party for doing so. It is very, very hard to make that work, but I don't think we're going to, realistically, I don't think we're going to see a coalition this time. There's no way we would work with the Tories this time.
We've heard who the Liberals would plight or not plight their troth to, but perhaps we can ask the other parties whether they would wish to plight their troth to the Liberals or how they would respond to that sort of situation. Or we'll go in reverse order. So, Daniel, perhaps you could start us off.
I think it's a tragedy, actually, the Liberal Democrats made that decision back in 2010. And there are different accounts. You read Andrew Adonis's account, it's rather different. And I think, actually, it was fatal for them and fatal for progressive politics in Britain, because to me, the dividing line had always been the Tories and the rest. So I think they made a mistake that time. I'm actually quite puzzled about the Liberal Democrat position now, because Tim Farron seems to have ruled out coalitions and has also ruled out winning. So I'm not quite sure what the point is. Well, you may be, but I have to say you've got quite a lot of catching up to do over the next week, I would suggest. So I'm not convinced also about this idea of standing down candidates, because I think that denies the electorate choices. What we saw, for instance, in the Richmond by-election, Richmond, Twickenham, whichever one it was, Richmond Park, yeah, was actually the electors are able to make the choices for themselves. Labour voters actually didn't vote Labour that day, but they should be given the choice. I don't think you can use the electorate as pawns in a game. So, tempting though it sometimes seems, I think actually you stand and you then allow people to make their choices. People are very intelligent. There's lots of tactical voting that goes on in Cambridge and other places, and I think let people make their choice.
Stuart.
Yes, thank you for the question. Firstly, I think you're right to put it because I don't think Julian can escape the record of the coalition government. Regardless of how he voted, his government enabled huge changes, privatisation of the NHS on a massive scale, austerity to local authority budgets, which have had huge effects on things like mental health support and support for homeless people. So they can't escape that record. However, it's a shame that we can't talk about coalitions and working together with other parties, because that is the most sensible way of doing politics, and it's something that happens in almost all the other countries around Europe. Progressive alliances on that subject, actually what a progressive alliance does is offer people a real choice, because as we saw here in the recent mayoral election, we had a Tory candidate up against a Labour candidate, a Lib Dem candidate and a Green candidate, and we couldn't find a way of working together because the other parties wouldn't countenance it. And what have we got now? We have a Conservative mayor, despite the fact that if we'd managed to work together, we might have been able to secure someone different who would have done the things that we all actually wanted them to do in Cambridge. Working together is the best way of achieving change. The Green Party would be happy to work with other parties where we agree and make deals where and when we need to. But what we really need in the longer term and what we really want to achieve is electoral reform, because there's been for far too long this emphasis on tactical voting everywhere. You're told in Cambridge by every party, vote for us to keep so-and-so out, vote for this party to keep so-and-so out. What we actually need is the ability for everyone to vote for what you believe in, and that would make our politics hugely different and hugely more progressive.
John.
I've done a lot of work over the years, cross-party, working with MPs and peers from Lib Dems and Labour. And actually, I think the coalition was a good thing. I think given the challenges that were facing the country in 2010 with the recession we inherited from Labour, we needed a more reasonable and rational debate. And I think that happened in this country because of the coalition. I think there were policies that happened under coalition government that would not have happened under any other single-party government. And for progressive politics, that's been a good thing. As someone who is a one-nation conservative, passionate about social justice, I think they were good things, and I'm pleased to be standing on a platform for and on behalf of Theresa May, knowing that she is equally passionate about making this a country that works for everyone. With regards to the specific question that was asked about Lib Dem king-making, I feel I ought to explain the joke that Julian started off with, because as he will know, all four of us have attended every single hustings that this great city has had so far. So where does this thing about stand-in come from? Well, I understand that a senior member of his team did talk to my campaign manager. I'm sure it was just in jest, and said that perhaps I, with my passion for social justice and commitment to freedom, should stand in for him. But the response was made, that would mean I would have to get a stand-in, and you wouldn't want that today. If you want true blue, you do not vote for someone who puts, as Daniel commented in yesterday's husting, someone who puts blue leaflets through your letterbox, but actually isn't really the true. You vote for someone who is the true blue. Any leaflet from me will have my imprint on and will have my photo on. Unless it's one of the national leaflets, in which case it will have the National Conservative imprint. If you want to vote with your principles, which I would encourage you to do, as Stuart has just done, vote for Conservative to continue a strong and stable leadership, not for chaos of either of the ex-MPs propping up or working with Mr. Corbyn.
Thank you. Next question, over there.
Good afternoon. I'm Andrew Thwaites. I work for CIE. And it's a bit of a rambling question, but I promise you I will get to the point sooner or later. So I wanted to ask, I don't know if this is on, I wanted to ask a wider point about trust in politics and the lack of trust that exists at the moment. Following on from the EU referendum, where both campaigns, but I feel particularly the Leave campaign, was based on a tissue of lies. We've got a Prime Minister who has performed U-turn after U-turn, the biggest of which is perhaps this general election, which we were promised would not be until 2020. We have a Labour Party who are making very popular, but quite frankly, fairly implausible policy promises. And frankly, because I believe they don't believe they can win this general election. We've got UKIP. Well, you know when Paul Nuttall and Nigel Farage are lying because their lips are moving. And a series of other parties spewing negative things in terms of why I shouldn't vote for other parties rather than positive reasons for voting for them. So for me, that paints quite a depressing picture of British politics at the moment. And I wonder why any of us here should believe anything we're told here today or nationally by national MPs and politicians.
Challenging question there, and obviously resonating with the audience. And thank you, Andrew. I remember you're asking challenging questions at this event in 2010. My memory doesn't stretch back to 2015, unfortunately. I think let's go back in reverse order on that, because clearly that's something that everybody will want to respond to. So, John, do you want to start us off?
The lack of trust in politics is one of the reasons I'm here today. So, 16 years ago, I think all of us remember where we were, 9/11, 2001. I was flying back from Tajikistan to the UK, got stuck in Munich airport for an hour while flights were suspended over the UK. And it was that day that I felt particularly strongly, maybe someone like me, who isn't the typical union hack or lawyer or banker or lawyer or union hack, someone who's got some real-world experience, someone who's lived in the Muslim world, someone who's had a career in adult education, works in the charity sector, someone who's different and can actually represent normal people rather than the typical person that winds up in Parliament. Maybe there's a place for someone like me in Parliament. And it was that day and that recognition that set me on a journey that has brought me to this point of standing on behalf of the Conservatives. So given that that is what brought me into politics, I would most definitely want to remain connected. I would want to be part of the solution of restoring trust in politics, not promising things I can't do, and wherever possible, trying to be positive and talking about what I can offer. I bring a breadth of experience, as I've already mentioned, and I'm promising to be a strong voice for Cambridge, campaigning positively on the concerns that the residents and businesses and universities and others here in Cambridge have. Not simply arguing bitterly or angrily against what's being proposed, but working with ministers and say, these are our concerns, these are the amendments we would like to see, this is the direction of travel that we would prefer. And that's my commitment to the party and to the city, that I will be positive and I will be a strong voice for Cambridge.
Thank you. Stuart.
Thank you for the question, Andy. I listened to enough of your rambling team talks when you managed my football team, so I'm used to hearing it still now. If you want...
Did you win?
Yeah. We did win every now and then. We won every now and then. Yeah. If you want politics to be different, you need to vote for it to be done differently. I hear from a lot of people on the doorsteps, a lot of people sometimes go to close the door and say, you're all the same, we don't believe in you. And I realise there is a big issue with trust in politics because people have been promised a lot which hasn't been delivered on. And the only way to go about changing that is to engage, to examine, to scrutinise and to vote for people that do it differently. For the very first time in this election campaign, I'm going to say that I actually agree with John on something here. Sorry about that, John. I also would rather not be in politics. I would rather not be a politician. I would rather be a nurse working in a good quality public health service, but it's something that I feel is disappearing, and I think it's so worth fighting for that it's worth getting involved in politics and standing to try and make a difference. And actually what's happened in this election campaign is one of the worst, most negative, cynical election campaigns by a party which I think I've ever seen, and which this country possibly has ever seen, where at every step politicians from the Conservative Party have tried to evade questioning, avoid debate and shut down debate, and avoid giving you the real opportunity to question them about their motives and about what they'll do for this country. There's been some real terrible moves in recent years, such as the Lobbying Bill and the Trade Union Act, which have sought to limit the input into our democracy that trade unions, that NGOs, that charities can have, while at the same time not tackling the problem of lobbying and financial influence over politics. I think it's right to say that no one party has a monopoly on wisdom and has all the best policy ideas. It's sensible that we work together and we recognise that we've got ideas that we should share and that we should work on together, which is why I'm glad to see that my party is working with other parties at trying to change minds and win elections and give people a choice. So all I would say is if you want politics to change, then you need to look at the people you want to change it and give them your support.
It is a very good question, and it's a very hard one for politicians to answer. I have to say, as a historian, I look back over the centuries, I'm not quite sure there's ever a time when politicians were loved or trusted. And perhaps it's partly in the nature of the job, because you're trying to make difficult, complicated decisions. And I think this was absolutely the case with the referendum last year. And trying to get people engaged in that was very, very hard. I was very struck. I've got a fantastic team of people in Cambridge Labour. It is a team, hundreds of people. But on referendum day, even though we were working cross-party with others, actually getting the numbers of people out there talking to people was tiny by comparison. And actually, my experience is the only way to build trust is just to talk to people on a regular basis. Now, we do have a system which mitigates against that in many places because, and I agree, I think we should have electoral reform and a changed system, because at the moment all the effort is concentrated into 50, 60 seats around the country, which means people who are living in South Cambridgeshire are far less likely to actually have conversations on the doorstep with politicians than in Cambridge, where, quite frankly, people are telling us to go away because we only spoke to them last week. But actually, that constant process of dialogue, and there are some councillors in this room who I know are part of that, I think does build a different relationship. What I also say is it's not just politics, it's also public services in general. If you ask people what do they think about social workers, quite often they'll say, oh, social workers are dreadful. Then you ask them about their social worker, oh, my social worker's wonderful. And we see a similar thing also with the politicians. Quite often people say, oh, politicians are dreadful. And you say, what did you think about David Howarth or Julian or Anne Campbell or even me? And they say, oh, they're all right. And there's a kind of disconnect here. So I don't think we should actually diss our political system, because I actually still think we've got a strong political system. But it could be so much better. And if we could spread it out, get more people involved, and actually concentrate on the things we have in common, that's what I don't actually particularly like about events like this, where it's point scoring, trying to find points of difference. Actually, there is much more common ground than you might imagine. And I think if we treat people with respect, even those we disagree with, and that for me is key post-Brexit, we can't just ignore the fact that half the country isn't of the view of most people in this room. We've got to go and engage with them. I tell you, I did some of that in Biggleswade. It's not easy sometimes.
Julian.
I think it's a really, really good question, and there is a fundamental problem with trust in politics, trust in democracy. And I agree with a huge amount of what's been said. I think there are lots of things which feed into it. Some of it is the tribalism, the fact that there is that tendency, and we've seen it, I think, get worse over the last few years, that everything that I think is perfect and everyone who disagrees with me is fundamentally evil. It's not a view I've ever shared, but I've seen it expressed by lots of people who will attack anybody who disagrees with them even slightly, and we see that far too often. I think we do see, and a lot of this, let's be frank, is the fault of politicians. There's a lot that we could do about it. The House of Commons could behave a bit more like a bunch of adults rather than less like some badly behaved school children at times. And I think that would show things off much better. And that hasn't happened. So politicians do have a lot to answer for, and if you look at the long-term polling on trust in politics, it's gone down. Interestingly, the trust level that's gone up the most, I think, is trust in the man on the street has gone up, and it's anybody who actually knows is an expert, in Michael Gove's terms, where trust has gone down. I think that is a real problem. I think the media also have a role to play, because they much prefer stories of somebody said something, somebody else disagreed, than agreement. I used to do daily politics quite often, I think twice, with Lisa Nandy, who's an extremely good Labour MP. I think once I was told off, once she was told off for not disagreeing when we were supposed to. So, well, but we did agree on this thing. Like, why pretend, for the cameras to disagree? So I think that the media do try to achieve that split. I think the BBC has increasingly presented extremes rather than trying to present the centre ground at all. And I think that's a big problem. There are also those who deliberately want to try to break down trust in politics. There are people who are very wealthy, some of the billionaires who own some of the media, for example, who don't want a functioning political system that could respond. They quite like it if nobody trusts anybody unless it is the front page of The Sun or The Times or any of the other papers that these people own. There is a deliberate assault there. And we're seeing also much more of an idea that anything people don't like is now derided as a lie. And that's also something which I think is really toxic to good decision-making. We will hopefully agree on what the facts are. We can disagree about what the solutions are. But that is changing. I did a debate in Peterborough about Remain and Brexit, and every single thing that I said that it was a UKIP-invited audience, so it was quite a tough crowd. Every single thing that I said they didn't like, they said was a lie. And it didn't matter what it was. In one case, the person I was debating with said that Winston Churchill came up and said, well, Winston Churchill was founding president of the European movement. I said, that's a lie. It's like, no, that's absolute historic fact. You can check that. And I think that is a real problem. But we have to make sure that we do stick to what we say. For what it's worth, I made a whole series of commitments in the run-up to 2010. I stuck to all of them, including, for example, voting against fees. And I think that's really important. I wish all politicians tried to make sure that manifestos were appropriate and they stuck to things they said they would do.
Thank you. We've got a question here.
It's just a quick one to follow up.
So can you stand and introduce yourself?
Oh, sorry. Hi, I'm Mark. It's just a quick question actually aimed at Julian, talking about false facts and fake news, and this question about trust. Can you explain why the Liberal Democrats in Cambridge leafleted a fake newspaper called the Cambridge Gazette the day after the local elections? Deliberate intent to mislead everybody.
And here we see the tribalism that you're talking about.
It is strange, Julian, isn't it? It's slightly odd, you've got to say. Sorry.
Fair to say this gentleman was wearing a green badge a bit earlier in the hustings, which has now
And
disappeared.
actually, here we see the problem with some of the tribalism. For what it's worth, Daniel, if you really want to talk about this, we could talk about the fact that I have not put out a single leaflet that has attacked any other candidate in this election. That's not something which you could say. You know exactly that there was a very, very nasty anti-Lib Dem piece, all in yellow, that you put out just after Manchester happened. You know, I'm not saying politics is perfect, but actually these sorts of attacks really don't help.
It wasn't nasty, it was just pointing out some of Tim Farron's views that people need to know about.
I was about to commend the urbane way in which this hustings has
Yes.
been conducted, a civilised manner, everybody's engagement. So I think if there's another question, we might move on quickly. Andrew. Just here.
Hello, I'm Andrew Coombe. I work for Cambridge English. I'd like to ask about, to go back to Brexit. Last year, nearly half the country voted to remain, and you all know a lot more people than that voted to remain in this area. And one of the key issues was free movement of labour and people. Now, we talk a lot about immigrants, and we've got lots of immigrant workers here who greatly enrich our organisation and our city. But equally, my children and a lot of their children saw free movement of people as an opportunity for their future. And they feel that the political establishment has let them down by ruling it out. So I'd like to know what your parties, not yourselves, what your parties will do to re-engage that feeling of hope for young people.
So if we can start off with Julian, we'll go right down the table.
Look, I mean, I think it's a really good question. You're right to say how important free movement is, both for people coming here, contributing to our society, and for the opportunity it provides for people leaving. When I was campaigning for Remain in the referendum that should never have happened, it was one of the 5 key things I talked about: prosperity, opportunity, peace, the environment, and security. And I think young people are going to massively lose out on the opportunities as a result of that. My party's been really clear. We would fight for free movement. We'd fight to give everyone a say and ideally stay in, because that is the thing which will provide young people with the very, very best opportunities, is if we can stay in the EU, have Erasmus, have the ability to go and work, study, live, do whatever you like anywhere in the EU and wider. That would be really important. So as a party, we're committed to that. We've pushed for that in Parliament. We will keep pushing for that. Personally, I'll continue to campaign to be in the EU until the day we leave. I'll then cry for a day or two and then campaign to get back in, because I think that's the right thing for young people. There are lots of other things that we could touch on. I expect in time we can't go all of it. Sorting out things like the job market, to have more constraints on zero-hours contracts and end-to-end paid internships. Sorting out housing so young people can actually afford to live there. Getting travel prices down, so we've proposed discounted travel for young people. I think there's a lot of really good things there, but I do think that leaving the EU will cause harm for young people that will last for decades to come, and it is an order of magnitude bigger than everything else.
Daniel.
My position has been very clear personally. As you know, I've voted against Article 50 at every moment. But the point you raise is an important one. And the Labour Party is a national party. And I think there's a danger for us in Cambridge of just closing our minds to what actually happened last year. Because you don't have to go very far up the road in Cambridgeshire. I mentioned Biggleswade already, but you can go to Ramsey, you can go to Wisbech, you can go all around this city, and you'll find a very different set of views. And if we just ignore those views and just wish they weren't there, then I'm afraid we're not going to be able to resolve this issue. So it's a very, very difficult one for a party that aspires to government, genuinely aspires to government, and also, for many of its representatives, despite their own personal feelings, had constituencies who voted to leave. So how do we solve that conundrum when basically Labour's position is an internationalist one, an open one, as I said, will stay in Horizon 2020, Erasmus, etc., etc. I'd say look at what Keir Starmer is saying and trying to do, because he is trying to square that circle in a way that gets us as close as possible to respecting the result of the referendum, which we have to do, but also keeping us as close as we can to what all of us in this room want. Now, I think actually the freedom of movement issue is the key to this. And I'd point you to some very good work being done by Professor Catherine Barnard, who some of you will know in this university. She launched the research actually at the Mickle House last week, and I broke off from canvassing to actually go to house. Sorry more people weren't there. But what she's done is she and her team have gone round the east of England running a series of events, some in Cambridge, but also in places like Boston and in Lincolnshire, which is the most leave place in the country. And what they discovered, what didn't come as a surprise to many of us, people weren't bothered about being in the single market. They were okay with that because they could see the advantages. People actually weren't that bothered about the European Court of Justice because, in fact, most people don't talk about it much, mainly. What they were bothered about was migration. And that's the bit we've got to solve. And I think actually Jeremy Corbyn actually almost stumbled into the right position in one of the debates the other day when he said, actually, people are okay with the idea of people coming here if they've got a job. Now, that isn't actually far from the actual official position. That's not what people think. People think we've got an open-door migration policy. Goodness knows we haven't. The number of people that both Julian and I have seen in our surgeries, I can testify to that. It's a really tough system. But that's not what people think. So I think what we've got to do is we've got to find some different language to explain how the system actually works to people. But a simple thing which says, if you come here, you're going to have a job, actually is a much simpler message for people. And if we have that, and that would require a little bit of movement perhaps from our European partners as well, who have the same issues, incidentally. You know, Marine Le Pen isn't just a flash in the pan, sadly. Then I think we could have a system which would work and which people could support. And the advantage of all this would be out of this trauma we've had through the last 2 years, is that we could end up in a position where Britain's part of something which we're actually positive about rather than always carping about and trying to leave. And that's where I want to get us to.
Yeah. I think what's happened recently, increasingly, is that we're failing to recognise the benefits that migration actually brings to the country. And we've had a real hard problem in selling that to people and telling them the benefits that it brings us. I'm sure most people in Cambridge appreciate the societal and the cultural benefits of migration, but what we're not telling people increasingly enough is the economic benefits of it as well. The fact that migrants who come here tend to be younger, of working age, paying taxes, which actually helps sustain our public services, and also spending money, which helps our businesses thrive. And I work in the NHS. I know exactly how much we rely on EU migrants and people from around the world. And frankly, we're not being honest enough with people about the possible effects of leaving the European Union and what that could do to the NHS and social care. Nothing that we can get out of the Brexit negotiations will be as good as free movement of people is for the UK currently. And actually, we've seen increasingly that the Tories' promise on driving down migration to the tens of thousands will cost the country billions of pounds and will also threaten our public services. And hopefully, once we're honest with people about the costs of driving down migration, they'll regret the move to leave the European Union and actually push for free movement of people as well. So my party would unilaterally declare that EU citizens who are here currently have the right to remain. We'll prioritise free movement of people as something that we want to focus on and want to protect as part of the EU negotiations. And what's really, really important as well is that our politicians and public figures are welcoming, and we have a rhetoric around migration that is welcoming rather than hostile, because British values of hospitality and generosity are the values that I recognise in my country, and that's what I want back. And actually, people I know from around Europe who are wanting to go back to their own countries currently because they feel so threatened by the mood in this country. And it's so important that we keep that talent and we keep the contribution that those people bring to our country. And finally, just on young people, I think it's horrendous, the deal that's being offered to young people at the moment by mainstream politics. A lifetime of debt to pay for their tuition, a future in a job market that's increasingly insecure, a housing crisis that means that many of them will be unable to find their own homes, and again, which has not been mentioned by any of the other candidates, if we don't have a planet to live on and a sustainable planet, there is no future for young people at all, and that needs to be addressed, and only the Green Party are serious about doing that in the next 5 years.
John. I've spent much of my adult working life working with refugees, asylum seekers, economic migrants, helping them get the skills to migrate to countries in Europe, including the UK, and to North America. Indeed, my wife is a migrant. I am proud of the contribution that immigration makes to this country, and I'm proud to be standing with Theresa May on a manifesto that celebrates the fact that we are probably the most successful multicultural, multiracial, multi-religious societies in the world. And that remains the case even despite the tragic and appalling incident in Manchester just a week or so ago. That's why I'm campaigning for a flexible, smart Brexit. I'm proud to be standing with Theresa May. Most people, I find, in hustings like this, haven't read or aren't even aware of Theresa May's 12 Brexit negotiating objectives. The media and the opposition likes to spin it as the Conservatives are adopting a hard Brexit position. That's nonsense. Read the 12 negotiating objectives. We want to guarantee the reciprocal rights of EU citizens here in the UK and don't think we should bargain away the reciprocal rights of British citizens living in the EU. We want to ensure that we can continue trading freely with European markets as well as negotiating new trade deals with other countries around the world. We want to ensure that Britain, and I would say Cambridge, remains the best place for science and innovation. And that's why we're committing to such huge investment into research and development. And contrary to what the Greens say, it's in the Conservative manifesto that we are saying we want to be the first party pledging to leave the planet in a better position than that in which we inherited it.
Fracking.
That is the environmentally sustainable position, the socially sustainable position, and the economically sustainable position on which the Conservatives are standing and for which I and my party will negotiate through and beyond the Brexit negotiations. It is not a hard Brexit position. It is what I call smart Brexit, arguing for a good and fair deal for the people of Cambridge, for the country, for the European Union, and indeed for the world.
Thank you. There's a question over there, but before we do that, there's some questions coming in from online. So if you wouldn't mind waiting, we'll just take one of those to start with.
I'll stand even though it's not me. We have the Porter's Lodge on Twitter. The broad question is, not the Porter's Lodge here, it's a satirical newspaper. What will you do for students, specifically those in Cambridge, if elected? That's to everyone. And they've just come back specifically wanting to know from Julian, why is your party not scrapping tuition fees?
Can we start with Julian? Sorry, I promised Stuart that we will start with him at one stage because I think we're slightly biasing the sampling. Okay, well, why don't we start with Stuart?
So the question was, what will we do for students?
Yeah.
The Green Party have consistently had an opposition to tuition fees. Every other candidate up here, their parties have had a role in expanding tuition fees or introducing them in the first place. We are clear that many other countries in Western Europe have no tuition fees. It's an investment in our young people and it's an investment in our future to help them get the skills that they need to go into public services or to go into businesses. And they will pay for that many times over through the taxes that they contribute in future. They don't need to be landed with a lifetime worth of debt to go and get a higher education. It's balmy to think that that's possible. And in England now, we're facing the highest average tuition costs in the world. And there's £50,000 worth of fees that are going to be hanging over students' heads for the rest of their lives. And regardless of whether they have to pay those fees off immediately or they have to pay them off in the future, what I've been told by welfare officers at some of the student unions in Cambridge recently is that fees and finance problems are one of the primary causes of mental health problems amongst young people and the reason they go and seek support. So my party is clear. We would abolish tuition fees, end student debt, and there are simple ways of paying for that through extending and increasing corporation tax, not up to a very high level, but still up to a level that's below the G7 average, which would enable us to do that. And also, there'll be nothing as good for students and as good for young people as our membership of the European Union and free movement of people. So that's something that I'll prioritise and protect if I'm sent to Westminster.
Daniel.
Well, we seem to have had this conversation once or twice before in Cambridge over the years, and I'm absolutely delighted that Labour's come to the position of getting rid of tuition fees because it's been an issue for us for many, many years, as many will know. The key question is it affordable and can it be done? And I think what's really interesting is looking at how much money has been lost to our public services by the decision by the Conservatives to cut levels of corporation tax and business taxes in general. So not only do we, when we look ahead to the future, can we see things that we can do, I think the question is, why on earth have we been suffering this kind of austerity for the last period when it wasn't actually strictly necessary? Because far from this being some kind of Marxist-Leninist paradise, as John is suggesting, actually this is bringing us into the mainstream of other European countries. You look at the levels of business taxation that we're talking about, they're going back to those tyrannical levels imposed by David Cameron back in 2010, 2011. You compare them to the levels of business taxes in other European and competitor countries, and they will remain lower. So it is eminently doable. The question is, what do you choose to spend your money on? And I think for all the reasons that Stuart has just outlined, I originally was quite prepared to defend a contribution from students. It seemed to me to be reasonable as about 3,000. 9,000, totally unreasonable. And we've seen the effect that's had on people and the huge levels of debt that people now probably won't even be able to pay off. And that's the other side to this equation. So what Labour will also do, apart from abolish tuition fees, is actually look at how we can unwind some of the damage that's been done to people who have already incurred this debt. So we won't be going up to the levels of interest rates and repayment, which are absolutely shocking. People being charged 6% on these debts. And we won't be freezing the threshold repayment levels. We can't undo it all, but we can undo some of it. And I think that's a huge offer to people, and it's no surprise to me that people are enthusiastic about it, but it mustn't just be for people, the half of the population who are getting the benefit of university education. We've got to put in similar money into our technical and vocational skills as well, because places like Cambridge Regional College have really suffered over the last few years. So reintroducing the educational maintenance allowance, ending the fees that apply in the FE sector as well, really important that we rebalance our educational system. So I think it's a big offer. I think it's now intergenerational unfairness. I think my generation and my parents' generation have actually done pretty well, and I think that's at the expense of a younger generation, and it's now time to make that big change, and Labour can do it and will do it.
John and then Julia. So I've spent a lot of my life working with some of the neediest and disadvantaged communities promoting education, indeed in the same way as my mother did before me, working in some of the most difficult council estates and the schools on those in this country. I believe in empowering students and empowering young people, indeed empowering all people to fulfill their potential. And that is something that isn't reported by the media. There's actually a lot of good work that has gone on the last 7 years. So for someone such as myself who's passionate about social justice, I'm amazed that most people don't realise that it's the Conservatives that have been redistributing wealth so that the richest are now paying more than ever before and are paying more than the poorest. The top 1% pay more than a quarter of all the tax that is collected in this country. The top 10% pay around 3/5 of all tax. That is then being used to take the 4 million poorest income earners out of tax altogether. 31 million middle income people who have benefited from the £1,000 cut in income tax rate. 61,000 people here in Cambridge alone. We are the ones who have been able to invest by cutting the corporation tax that others would raise, securing a greater revenue for the Exchequer, being able to invest that money into schools, into our students. But it's not just about money. It's not just the fairness question of no student has to pay back their loan until after they earn in £21,000. People like me who went into the charity sector who didn't have to start paying back our student loans for years because I was below that threshold. It's not just that there is a fairness, that the people who gain from the education ultimately contribute to the education. It's actually about more than that. It's about this question of each individual being able to fulfill their potential. And that's why I'm excited to be standing on a platform with Theresa May saying we are going to promote non-academic routes. We have introduced the technical qualifications, the T-levels. We are the ones who are investing in degrees. 3,300 young people here in Cambridge alone who have been able to go through apprenticeships, and we're going to build on that. We're promising another 3 million in the next 5 years, and we've also introduced the degree apprenticeships, working with industry to ensure that these young people are getting the skills that industry wants in order that they can go on to the jobs that we as a country and we as a high-skilled area need. So it's about fulfilling the potential of every individual, and that's the platform that I'm pleased to be standing on.
Thank you. And just the question was originally directed at Julian, so perhaps it's fitting that he should answer it.
Yeah, so I mean, tuition fees, there's a lot more to talk about. Tuition fees is something which is really quite personal for me. My first general election was 1997. I was one of the last years to not have to pay any tuition fees. And I was very involved with campaigning, and there was a very effective Labour leaflet that came out from Anne Campbell which said, big, bold headlines, no tuition fees here. Fantastic, a real commitment from Labour, no tuition fees. And she then voted for them. And I remember that sense of betrayal. I was actually leading several of the protests about it, the no ifs, no buts, no education cuts type things. I was heavily involved with that because I thought it was profoundly the wrong thing to do. I was then doing a PhD when Labour, who'd said they'd never increase them, you wouldn't have top-up fees, then tripled them and introduced top-up fees. And again, I led quite a lot of the protests because it was the wrong thing to do. And I've continued to campaign against tuition fees my entire adult life. When I was elected, I had said I would vote against fees and try to seek a fair alternative. I was the first MP for Cambridge to actually vote against a fee increase, and never did. And I did what I said I would do. I voted against the fee increase. I actually tabled an amendment then to get rid of fees completely. It's worth noting, given where we are now, not a single Labour MP backed me on that, and as you know, it didn't succeed. So I've kept campaigning on this for a very, very long time. It's one reason why, in 2015, the National Union of Students, which is hardly famous for being a very pro-Lib Dem organisation, actually put out a piece about me where they described me as a great friend to the student movement and thanked me for my work on this, fighting against disabled student allowance, graduate funding, and much, much more. I would dearly love to get rid of tuition fees. For all the reasons Stuart says, they are the wrong thing to do. There is a way of collecting the money from progressive taxation from people who earn enough. Having students pay is the wrong thing to do. But I would only promise that if I could see how to cost it, and that there is an honest way of costing it which actually adds up. Otherwise, you don't get anywhere. It's worth saying, by the way, people talk about 2010, what happened. Labour actually wanted to increase tuition fees. They've been quite clear about that and open. Had Labour won, they would have significantly increased tuition fees. The Brown Review called for unlimited fees. This was the review which Labour set up. So the story is more complex than it has been. If I could see a costed way of getting rid of fees, I would do. And if I'm the MP, and there is a vote on a costed way of getting rid of tuition fees, I would be delighted to vote for it and get rid of those wretched things. But I don't see how that money is there when there are so many other priorities, the NHS, education, actually reversing the welfare freeze, which hits so many people in the poorer half of society. What I would focus on as my top priority would be helping students with the cost of being a student now, because that's the thing that really hits mental health. That's the thing that really stops people. So that means bringing back grants, a student nurse bursaries and all sorts of things, helping with housing, with travel, with food, with drink. That would be the #1 priority. But, if I could get rid of tuition fees, it would be the culmination of a campaign since I was 18. I would be utterly delighted to do it.
So join Labour.
Decisive response.
Sorry.
Your party's not going to do it.
But I'm afraid, Daniel, given all the track record of Labour lying about it repeatedly, I just don't trust Labour on it. I just
on
don't.
dodgy ground here, Julie.
Decisive response on that. We've got a question there. But before we move on to that, can I just ask, candidates, because one of the issues is that university education in this country is underfunded.
Indeed.
And there is a question as to whether rebating student fees or getting rid of them would be the best way of addressing that funding deficit. And just parking the question of student fees, could you, the candidates, give their respective view on what ought to be done about the funding shortfall in the university sector? Daniel, I'll start with you and then we'll sort of go round.
I think that's a really important question. It's something that when this policy was announced by the Labour front bench was the very first thing I asked, because what I don't want to do is go back to the situation we had in 1997 when we were woefully underfunded. Now, I think actually university funding actually through this system at the moment actually has been quite a lot better for a while. So what we're going to do is make sure that any loss, potential loss, is more than made up for through a changed system. And that's what I will be fighting for and making sure happens, because we cannot go back to the system before. So I quite understand why the universities, we're in a period where universities find it difficult to comment on this, but I know there's anxiety and worry about this. But Julian says it can't be done. Actually, it can be done. And that's why Labour's costings are important. Now, I know the IFS has said we may not get 49 billion, we may get 40 billion. Well, actually, 40 billion is a lot. And I think there is the money in this country. And that's what this election is actually really about. Are we going to continue to allow a very small number of people to get richer and richer and richer while the rest of the country struggles? That's the big choice. You can have a debate then as to how you use the resources that you get. But I'm quite comfortable with it going to universities as long as it gets to universities.
John and Stuart.
Yeah, so I'm proud to be standing on a manifesto that's committing to put more money into further education as well as to universities. I welcome Daniel's comments about the fact that it has been better in recent years, We need to continue the course that we are on. We cannot put that at risk. Income inequality now is lower than it has been since I was a student here in the late 80s. That is social progress. That is what a progressive party who doesn't shout about the fact that it's progressive, but the Conservatives, gets on and delivers for people. If we risk the economy by taking a different route that involves higher taxes, higher debt, and fewer jobs, there will be less money for education. There will be less money for universities, and we will not be able to continue the good work that we have done in recent years. It is about empowerment, but it is fundamentally, as Daniel says, about the economy. Are we going to continue with a strong and stable approach to the economy, or do we risk the chaos of an unstable hung parliament led by someone who doesn't even have the confidence of his own MPs?
Stuart. Sorry. We talk about high tax, high debt, all of these problems. The fact is, if you're poor in this country, you do face a high amount of debt and a high amount of tax. Simple fact is, the poorest 10% of this country pay more in their income in tax than the richest 10% do, when you take into account the different range of tax measures, such as VAT, which your government put up, which affects poorest people the most, when you take into account national insurance and council tax. And that's ignoring the huge amount of wealth of rich people that we don't even know about in multinational corporations, which your government have cut the funding for HMRC and cut the staffing budget so that we can't pursue that wealth and make sure that it comes into our economy to pay to sustain our public services.
We have tackled tax evasion.
No, not in any way. You've cut HMRC's budget drastically. But to answer your specific question, the current system is not the most effective way of ensuring investment in higher education. A huge amount of student debt will never be paid back, and actually it's going to add a huge amount to public debt in the coming 10 or 15 years. And the biggest thing that threatens funding for higher education is our withdrawal from the European Union. So we would make sure that we would protect those sources of funding. And actually, I think it's really important that we consider the aspect of what universities are actually for as well. Because making it just a marketplace where people buy and where people come and have to pay huge fees ignores the fact that universities are good places of learning, and people should be able to go and encourage and try and learn different things, rather than it just being a marketplace of selling degrees.
Julian, a quick final word.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Stuart said about the approach. The analysis that I've seen from universities suggests that there could be a 25% gap in the amount of money that they need. And obviously, that wouldn't be good. It wouldn't be a great thing to get rid of student fees, fantastic, and then give a poor education to students. That can't be the right answer. So you have to make sure that there is that support. And there are choices about whether you want things that are actually costed and realistic or not. The IFS have been quite clear, very critical of both the Conservatives and Labour. I have to say, while I accept John's comments that Corbyn doesn't have the confidence of his backbench, at least he had the confidence to show up to the debate yesterday, which Theresa May didn't have the confidence to do. It's not very strong and stable to not show up. But I think just one other thing from the IFS, because there is a big question about distribution and how progressive you want things to be. And they did an interesting analysis of the three main parties. I'm sorry, they didn't look at the Greens, Stuart. Of what the consequence would be. And Labour would hit the top 10% the hardest. But what was interesting was the party that would help the bottom 50% the most was the Liberal Democrats, because we would reverse the welfare freeze, which Labour's manifesto does not do. We would end the child tax credit constraint, so that if you want to have a third child or more, women have to fill in this atrocious form to say that they've actually been raped to have the child. So actually, if you want a progressive system, then actually it's the Lib Dem manifesto which would be better according to the independent IFS.
OK, thanks for that. Question here, and then there's another one online and one here, and we're sort of running out of time, so if the responses can be kept concise and to the point, that would also be helpful.
Hello, Matt Barradell. I work in CSD. My question is about rent. Currently, I pay a fortune in rent. Landlords and estate agents completely pillage everything we earn. What are you going to do about it?
John, can you start?
I'm absolutely amazed that my friends who are in rented property pay more per month than I and others like me who pay for a mortgage. That cannot be right. Part of the issue is supply. That is something that's recognised by all the parties, that there haven't been enough properties built for as many decades as we can remember. There's a couple of things I am pleased about. So one of the long-term challenges that I've been able to work with government ministers and the Prime Minister's Policy Board on in recent months has been this question of housing. And I was excited to see in the government's white paper on housing some things such as greater use of modular housing, greater encouragement for small developers so that we can get more houses built more quickly, which will help with the supply problem. That obviously doesn't help with those who are in the rented sector right at this moment in time, but coming down the line, it will. And there are other measures in that paper which I think are, down the long term, going to help. I'm actually really proud of the record of the Conservatives over the last 7 years, building almost 3 times as many social housing units as happened over 13 years of Labour. Not something you would expect, not something that gets reported in the media, but again, it's what progressive conservatism looks like in action. We're helping the most disadvantaged, and we would want to help those in the rented sector to have more secure tenancies and to have higher quality tenancies. And crucially, what we've been doing in recent years is help to buy. Those who want to purchase, to be able to get help with a deposit in order to be able to get on the housing ladder.
Julian.
Look, it's a really important question. It's one of the crucial things for Cambridge, and I think the biggest thing that threatens Cambridge's future success is the cost of housing. You know, time and time again, people don't come here because they just can't afford to. We've seen this with nurses. There's been wards closed because nurses just couldn't live close enough to get in. We see this across the entire area. It's something I did quite a lot of work on with groups like Generation Rent, who you may be familiar with. And when I was in Parliament, I tabled a private member's bill, which would try to address some of the things that we're talking about here. So that would be secure tenancies. I think since my bill, there's now general agreement. That's the right thing to do. There's an end protection from rogue landlords, because some landlords behave atrociously. So I didn't pass the bill, but we did manage to get access to ombudsmen, which is quite useful when things do go wrong. An end to these exorbitant letting agent fees. You know, it's atrocious that people can charge huge amounts of money like that. There's a lot more that we need to do as well. In some areas, I've been talking to some of the housing associations about living rents, where rent would be tied to income. And so you'd set it at a rate which would say a third of your income, so it would be actually affordable rather than the affordable rents that you sometimes see. We'd like to set up a rent-to-buy scheme with some properties where the rent that you pay wouldn't just be lost, but would then be used to be able to purchase the property later on if you wanted to. I think we also need to change the whole tax system, which does advantage landlords far too much over tenants. And I think if we could find that rebalance, then we would get at this absurd situation where the mortgage is often much, much lower than the rent is. Ultimately, though, the answer has to be about getting more homes. If you have high demand and not enough houses, prices will be high, and Cambridge is very attractive and very successful. Some of that can be done around Cambridge, is being done around Cambridge. We need to make sure there's enough affordable, truly affordable ones there. We're also going to have to go elsewhere. So I mentioned earlier this east-west rail line going out towards Bedford. If you then put a town on it with 20,000 homes, well, you now have a whole lot of people who can be 15 minutes away from New Addenbrooke Station, 20 minutes from the city centre, 25 minutes from the science park. That starts to be really attractive as a place to live. And that can start to take some of the heat out so that rents will become more affordable. Because you're right to highlight this.
Daniel.
It's probably the fundamental problem that has vexed policymakers about the British economy post-war, because I think our dysfunctional housing system has been at the heart of our economic problems. So there can be very long answers, but I know the Chair wants us to be succinct. I'd agree with much of what Julian has said, but I do think the mantra of endlessly saying just more homes is the answer. It isn't the answer if they're being bought for investment opportunities, and then people are basically being ripped off when they're rented. And I'm afraid that's what we're seeing. Developments are bought off-plan from investors in other countries. So this is a very, very big thing to try and resolve. Cambridge, you're absolutely right. It is putting people off. It's impossible for public service workers to actually live here. Ed Miliband came here in 2015 to launch Labour's plans, which remain the same, which is to move from 6-month tenancies to 3-year tenancies, because far too often the rent is jacked up every 6 months when people are given a choice, which is pay more or go somewhere else, and it's no choice at all. So there are things we can do, but personally I think it actually is going to need a much bigger set of changes. And for instance, the selling off of the council homes, which are now so often rented out at huge cost, has been a terrible, terrible failure over years and years and years. So I sympathise. I wish I could say to you, there's a magic solution instantly. The truth is, there isn't. It's going to need a fundamental change in attitude, particularly of an older generation that doesn't seem to understand that unearned wealth they've got in their homes. Where did it come from? You bought a house for £5,000 in Searle Street when I graduated and it's now worth £500,000. Where exactly did the other £495,000 come from?
Stuart.
Thank you for the question. I fully appreciate your concerns. I'm a nurse working here. I don't think I'll ever have the chance to buy a home in Cambridge unless something changes drastically. And the simple fact is the housing market is broken, and that needs to be fixed, because unless we fix the housing market, the more homes we build, as has already been said, will go to speculators and go for investment rather than actually focusing on making sure we have decent, affordable homes for local people. There's a number of things we can do to fix that. At the moment, a number of the public subsidies that are paid out, benefits such as housing benefit and housing allowance, are actually going to subsidise private landlords. Whereas we used to actually use public money to build more public housing, now all the public money we spend, a lot of it ends up in the hands of private landlords. And as you've said, for people in low incomes who are paying high rents, that's essentially a tax on them living, on their living costs to private landlords. So let's fix the market. Let's do what Labour didn't do in 13 years in government and end the right to buy policy, because council homes and social homes should be options for generations to come and shouldn't end up in the hands of private landlords, as many of the homes that used to be council and socially owned around Cambridge have done. We can follow Scotland and we can follow Wales in doing that. It's quite simple. Let's end policies that inflate house prices, such as Help to Buy, because all that's done is make homes less affordable for many young people. And let's stop selling off homes to foreign investors before they're offered to local people as places to live. And in the longer term, we need to make sure we're building a lot more socially affordable homes through public money.
Thank you. There's another question online. Ashley, I think you.
This one comes from a member of staff watching on Yammer. It's a two-pronged international one. Who do you think is the greatest threat to global security? Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, or Kim Jong-un? And what strategies do you believe in for dealing with the threat of ISIS?
Stuart, you want to start?
Okay.
Can you only choose two?
I finally get the chance to start, and it's with this question. Okay. I believe the biggest threat to international security and to the future of the planet is Donald Trump. Undoubtedly, his willingness to withdraw from the Paris Climate Change Accord threatens everything. And recently we've heard that China, that Russia, that other countries want to push ahead with honouring their commitments, because unless we take serious action internationally in the coming years, global warming will become out of control and we'll lose the ability to control it and to stop it happening. And if he pushes ahead with that, it's a huge danger to world security. And I think the best strategy for dealing with him is to ignore him and to get on with making sure we build those international alliances to deal with climate change without him, because he can't turn his back on economics. Renewable energy is the technology of the future. The costs are plunging. If he wants to turn away from that, it's going to harm the US economically, as well as all the other harms that will come with it as well. And as for the best strategy of dealing with ISIS, we need to invest in protecting ourselves in the right ways possible, making sure that we've got the right protections, that there's proper funding for the intelligence agencies, also in taking into account the problems against cyber warfare, which is why I don't think investing over £100 billion, or whatever the ultimate cost of Trident will be, is the most effective way of defending ourselves. Let's take that and invest it better elsewhere and in modern ways of defending ourselves. And we need to promote a foreign policy that promotes peace and cooperation, and stop selling arms to countries and stop invading countries to making those problems worse.
Daniel.
Again, you're looking for short answers, and I would agree with much of what Stuart has said. I'm not sure I'd pick any one of them as the most dangerous. They're all dangerous in a very dangerous and uncertain world at the moment. And I think to that extent, stepping away from the European Union and our European Union partners is exactly the wrong thing to be doing at the moment. And I think the only way of dealing with these issues is building support for the international agencies and working through the United Nations. And I do think actually that Jeremy Corbyn has got a long record of absolutely saying those things and believing in those things. And I have to say, there's been some comments about Jeremy, but Boris Johnson as Foreign Secretary, come on, he's going around the world insulting people and adding to the dangers. So don't back that coalition of clowns that is the Tory party.
You might want to respond, John, on that.
So my answer is influenced by having spent the best part of a decade living and working in the former Soviet Union on the borders of Afghanistan, and indeed being married to an American. So of your three that you gave us a choice, Putin was a strong man who was unrestrained in the world. He felt able to go into Ukraine. The world needed another strong man. I have utter faith in the American balance of powers of our transatlantic cousins that Mr. Trump will not be allowed to do anything that we as a democracy also wouldn't want to see. I think the rise of North Korea and some of the recent aggression from them is concerning, but we can take some comfort in the new defensive missile system that we've seen tested this week by the Americans. So I believe in the necessity of international institutions like the UN to deal with groups such as the so-called Islamic State. They are the biggest threat to us here in the UK at the moment, and that is why it is right that as a government we've invested in the new cybercrime unit, why we've invested in another 1,900 officers for MI5 and for GCHQ. This government takes law and order and national security seriously. Conservatives understand that the first responsibility of government is to keep its people safe. That is what we are doing, and that is what we will continue doing under Theresa May.
Julian.
I came back from a holiday in Wales to discover that people were hunting Pokemon through the streets of Cambridge and Boris Johnson was Foreign Secretary. And I couldn't quite work out which was more surreal of the two. But I think to go back to the question about the three potential leaders, I think they're all pretty terrifying and in different ways. And it's hard to pick just one of them who will be there. There will be some constraints on Trump, but I find him terrifying. Stuart's right to talk about the climate risk that he has there. And it's the biggest change from Obama, who I didn't agree with on everything, but boy was he a force for good, to Trump. There was a lovely comment that you can actually see the peaceful transition of power, that it went from Obama being the leader of the free world 1 second, and the next second it was Angela Merkel. That change from America being hopefully a positive influence to a fantastically negative one is the most harmful. I think Putin is long-term the most dangerous. Trump isn't going to last all that long, it seems, with all of the problems that he's having. But Putin has shown that he will interfere with other countries' democracies. He will attack other countries. I think he is extremely terrifying. In terms of ISIS, I mean, I agree with a lot of what Stuart said. We absolutely should scrap Trident. It's something I've argued for a long time. We can make ourselves much safer by spending that money in other ways and still have money left over for the NHS, housing, and much more. It will not help to defend us from Daesh there or any attacks here. What will do, yes, it's the ethical foreign policy. Yes, it's an end to arms sales. We often provide the weapons for all sides in many of these conflicts. I think it also is about the international aid that we provide, trying to make the rest of the country a better place. Because I think if you can find more places in the world where they have an optimistic outlook, where people do have employment, people do have things to do, people do have a sense of purpose in their lives, that is the best way of combating Daesh and all the other groups there. That is the big thing that Britain can do.
Thank you. Chance for one final question. Bennett, you had your hand up earlier on.
Bennett Steinberg, Group Public Affairs. There is an element of consensus emerging here, and that is that you all have a magical money tree. The Tory tree is quite small, but it's still there, and the Labour one is very, very large, but it's there. But you've all got a magical money tree, which is basically other people's money in their pockets. Is there anything that you think that the state shouldn't be doing now that you would cut so we can actually save some money somewhere, or is it simply a continuation of expanding the state, and expanding the state?
Daniel, do you want to start off on that?
Well, I think you're borrowing a phrase from a particular political party there, and certainly I would also give it a Trident. I see no need for it. But actually, I will defend a bigger state, because the extremists in this country at the moment are the Conservatives, who try to create a small state economy. And to have a civilised society, actually, you pay tax, and that is what pays for living in a civilised society. So you can have your small state, Bennett, but what it will mean is people sleeping rough in the streets. It'll mean people going to the food banks, and it's not a country I want to live in. I want a better world than that, and we can do it.
Julian.
I have to say I completely agree with Daniel on that. It is really important that we do have a state that can provide support, that can do the NHS, that can provide education, that can provide help for people. Could be any of us who need help. If we fall ill, disability, homelessness strikes people who aren't expecting it. So I don't agree that a small state is a good thing. There are absolutely things I think the state should stop doing. We talked about Trident. That's one example. That's a huge amount of money. This is one of very few countries which detains people indefinitely for immigration purposes. Now, I think that's inhuman and immoral. It also costs a huge amount of money. If you'd like to join me in trying to get rid of that, fantastic, we can agree on that. We could reduce the number of people held in prison for very large periods of time to no effect whatsoever. That would save a lot of money and be better for people. And you talk about the magic money tree and the idea that it's all other people's money. The state fundamentally is spending money that is raised from taxes. That is a good thing. That is how the state works. And yes, if you push taxes ludicrously high, I saw a suggestion at one thing of the 120% tax rate, that is not going to work. But we can put corporation tax back up. We can lift capital gains tax back up to where we put it during the coalition, which the Tories have cut, was higher than Labour. We can collect that money and use it, and actually people will be better off. People in society who earn money will be better off when society is doing well. Because who is it who educates the people who work for you to earn the money? Who is it who provides the roads that enable you to drive around with a car you've bought? All of that depends on the state.
Stuart.
Thank you. Interesting question. After the financial crash of 2008 and 2009, the government magically found a huge money tree to bail out the banks of this country. I would make the point that actually what we have in this country now is socialism for the rich and capitalism for the poor. We've seen that we're able to find the money for quantitative easing, tens of billions worth of pounds, but actually we've paid off the debt of the financial crisis off the backs of nurses and teachers and public servants and people who've had to pay those costs. And even on their own terms, austerity, which we've had since 2010, is the most nonsensical economic policy. It does not make sense to strip demand out of an economy at a time when you need people to be able to spend some money, to spend in shops, to spend so that it generates business, it generates income. And on the final point, public investment in hospitals, in schools, in young people's, in early years education is an investment. It's an investment in people and it's an investment in the future. And I think it was Warren Buffett, a billionaire in the US, who pointed out that he paid less in tax than his cleaner did. And actually the wealthiest in this society should be happy to say that they'll make their contribution so that we can fund a better country for all of us.
John.
You were right to say there's no money tree. There's no magic money tree. There are only taxpayers who pay taxes, and those taxes are used by the government to fund the things that we, as taxpayers, want. Theresa May, when she was on the steps of Downing Street and consistently since, has said she wants to invest in the disadvantaged. She wants to help the homeless. She wants to help the people who aren't able to go to university. She wants to help the people who are ostracized for whatever aspects of their background or identity it is. It's Conservatives who have invested to relieve or prevent poverty for 1 million people in the last 7 years. That's something I want to continue. I'm glad that that's something that's in the Conservative manifesto, that we aim to halve homelessness in the next 5 years. I think there's something like 84 projects around the country that have been trialling different approaches to deal with rough sleeping. And I'm glad to fund those kind of projects as a One Nation Conservative who is passionate about social justice. In terms of things that I think we could cut back on, I would agree actually with the point about prison. I think there are lots of people in prison who probably shouldn't be there, particularly people with mental health struggles. And that's also why I am pleased to be standing with Theresa May on a platform and a record of putting $11.5 billion into mental health treatment and a commitment in a manifesto to train and fund 10,000 new mental health professionals in the NHS and to put a qualified mental health first aider into every school and encourage the same for businesses.
Time's up, I'm afraid. So thank you, everybody, for being such a good audience, and thank you, candidates, for being lively, engaged, civilised, polite, and answering the questions, actually, which is always a great thing. I'm going to abuse my chairman's position once again, as I have the last two hustings, I think, to ask a final question, which I'm not really expecting an answer to, but I hope I will see some action on it, which is that we have suffer here a problem of the Freedom of Information Act, which we are subject to it, and neither of our competitor exam boards are. There is provision in the Act for it to be extended to cover other entities that are delivering public services. It seems to me shining light on the institution of public exams is a good thing. So if I could ask your commitment, whichever of you is elected, to pursue this. I've been corresponding with the Department of Justice ineffectively since 2004, so you might be able to be more effective in pursuing that objective. So I leave you with that thought. But thank you very much indeed for what I think has been a great and interesting debate, and certainly given me food for thought as I nurse the postal ballot that's sitting in my briefcase back in the office. And can we have a round of applause, please, for the candidates?